Yep. I've got a wide and varied background in IT. I've not worked only as a software tester, but I've also worked in development, project management, and of what particular relevance, I've worked in auditing, and that's all shaped my views about testing and particularly about standards. That experience has been with IBM and also prior to that with General Accident, which was one of the biggest insurance companies in the UK. It's gone through various mergers and it's now part of Aviva, which is the largest insurer. I'm going to be talking about standards, but although I'm highly critical of software testing standards, I do believe that standards are a good thing. They've got great economic benefit. They improve communication. They help keep the world connected. They provide consumers with the information they need about products. They protect responsible suppliers from competition from less responsible competitors. So standards are a good thing. However, there's a couple of aspects to them that are a bit more questionable. Not questionable, but they've got potentially worrying implications. They can be attached to contracts and they can be used to increase professional discipline. And that's something I'm particularly worried about in the case of testing. Standards are a good thing, but testing standards, I've never actually seen a convincing justification for testing standards. A defense of standards, it's always a defense of standards in general, or it's an argument that testing standards provide some guidelines that are useful in particular in certain cases. I've never actually seen a convincing or even an attempted convincing case for testing standards. I'm not going to talk about the content of standards or about why I believe they're a bad thing. Go and see what James Bach and Michael Bolton have written. They've written some really good stuff. James Bach never pulls his punches, and he certainly doesn't on ISO 29119 and calls it bullshit. Ian there provided a rather more nuanced criticism, implying that it's basically pointless. Go away and read what people like that, what Ian has written about factory testing, and he referred obliquely to that in his question, the threat to the whole testing profession if we go down a route where we don't differentiate and it's just some sort of mass generic commodity that we're selling. I'm going to be looking more at the economic commercial side, and that's because I did an economics degree at university, and it was largely pointless because what I learned wasn't really much to do with economics. These are the 5 things that I learned. It's actually legible on the screen. I think that what I'm seeing on the screen is slightly different from, it's a bit difficult to read in the mirror. But the 5 things I learned was that there's far too many total, quite unjustified certainty around. People who should know better have quite fixed opinions with inadequate evidence, and they don't question that certainty. Pretty much everything I learned at university about economics was far too simplistic, or it was just rubbish. Something useful that I learned was that the assumptions that people start off with usually dictated their conclusions. People that have a left-wing political perspective fastened onto the economic theories that matched that, and likewise, if they went to university with a right-wing viewpoint, they'd find the right-wing economic arguments far more convincing. They'd simply pick the economic analyses and studies that fitted their worldview. Something I learned when I had to look at problems, things I didn't understand, was it was always a useful guideline or heuristic to follow the money, who benefits. And finally, I learned always dig deeper, always look below the surface. And these lessons have helped shape the way that I look at standards. I'm going to be talking about some economic concepts, not because they're necessarily informative in their own right, but I want to set the scene for, I want to explain why software testing standards fall into a long recognized pattern of rigging markets, forcing uncompetitive practices on consumers in the marketplace. Not because this provides the answer, but I want to tell you that people resistant to software testing standards are concerned about what it might do. It's not paranoia, and it's not resistance to change. I want you to see how testing standards fall into that well-established pattern that economists have seen that regulators are concerned about. And I want to introduce this idea of economic rent. It goes back to Adam Smith. There are three factors of production: land, labour, and capital. And the only two factors, well, all income from production comes from those three. Labour and capital are the only ones that actually have real skin in the game, that put work in. Labour has to work hard. The owners of capital risk losing that capital, and they see it depleted, depreciated from being used. The owners of land, they've got that land at the end of the day. They don't actually put anything in. What they get is just free money, money for doing nothing. That was the economic theory. And economic rent went on. The idea was developed to refer to income that people get above what is justified by the free market. Joseph Stiglitz, the American economist, put it quite well. There are two ways to become wealthy: to create wealth or to take wealth from others. And taking wealth from others in economic terms is economic rent. Economic rent is basically free money. It can come through, at the most crude and extreme, from theft. You get it from rare talent, from monopoly profits, or from insider dealing. But there are some aspects of, some features of economic rent, some of the ways that it's been manifested are relevant to testing standards. And one of these is asymmetric knowledge, which I'll be coming on to talk about later, where one party to a transaction knows more than the other and can take advantage of that knowledge. There's inappropriate regulation. There's patent ambush, where somebody who owns a patent manages to get that incorporated into a standard, and then they can profit from that because people have to follow they have to buy the patented technique or tool in order to comply with the standard. There's collusion over standards, which is something that the standards bodies are very concerned about, where commercial bodies, companies who favour and sell a particular technique or process or good, they collude to get that defined as the standard, thus excluding competition. And I think that that's got great relevance to ISO 29119. I'll come back to that. But rent seeking is the process by which people go after economic rent. And from the economic perspective, rent seeking is just, it's money down the drain. It's a negative sum game because the gains that people get from indulging in rent seeking, going after that free money, is less than what is lost by the rest of the economy, the wider community. There's a lot of interesting work being done on the question of economic rent and rent seeking and game theory. The whole economy, the whole community, society benefits if people refrain from rent seeking, from chasing the free money, the easy money, from trying to rig the market. But it's in the interests of individuals to do it. It's in my interest that nobody else does it, but I should be able to get away with it. So there's a lot of interesting work being done in game theory to try and understand what's going on. But in the case, the general case is that rent-seeking provides a few big winners who get a lot, and the people who lose out generally lose out by a small amount each, and so they don't really notice or care, and the rent-seekers are able to get away with that. But I think it's slightly different in the case of software testing standards, because there are a few big winners who will be the software testing consultancies that helped to devise ISO 29119 and who will profit from selling the services required to implement and conform to standard. And the losers will be the wider testing profession, the testers who have to comply with it, the companies that find they're spending a fortune on poor quality testing, on the consumers who will lose out because they're getting poorer quality services and products. You might notice that there's been that box, knowledge is power, and that's the key point. Rent seeking through standards can only work where the people who are the victims don't understand, don't know what is being done, where the knowledge is in the hands of the rent seekers. So in order to challenge that, to fight back, it's important that people understand and talk about the problem. A particular form of rent seeking that is potentially dangerous for testing is that of regulatory capture. A lot of people assume that regulation, that companies are opposed to regulation, they just want to be allowed to get on with things in the free market, but it's long been recognized by economists, by by lawyers, politicians, that a lot of corporations are really quite happy to be regulated because that gives them the chance to frame the debate the way they want, to ensure that regulation suits them and can be used and abused to keep out competitors, to keep out new competitors. The victim, of course, is the consumer who ends up screwed. There are various forms of regulatory capture. Most obviously, there's favourable legislation. There's cognitive capture, where you ensure that the regulators have got the right mindset. They're good, sensible guys. Like, I run a company, and it's reassuring to know that the guy who's the regulator has the same sort of mindset, comes from the same part of society, is the sort I can get along with. And that's a real danger for regulators, that they end up with the same mindset as the people that they're trying to regulate. You've also got revolving doors where people switch from working for the regulator to going out to work in commerce. In the United Kingdom, the guy who is the chief executive for HM Revenue and Customs, that's the equivalent of, is it the Internal Revenue Service? The tax guys here in the US? Yes. Well, the guy that runs the equivalent in the UK has left. He's gone to work for Deloitte as a tax consultant. Well, I mean, why wouldn't you? I mean, it's a great career move, but is it really in the wider interests of the UK? Well, I think not. And the final one is licensing, which is potentially dangerous, or certainly interesting for testers. There are lots of professions that are licensed and regulated. Doctors, there are some libertarians that think that doctors should not be licensed, that the free market should take care of it, that the good doctors will get forced out of business because people will not want to die. I think it's a very controversial point, and you have to be a fairly extreme libertarian to accept that. Taxi drivers are licensed here in New York and in most places, and I mean it's not as obvious a case, but I still think there's a very strong case for that. I've been in cities in South America where the taxis are not regulated, and you really have to be very careful about the vehicle you're getting into to make sure it's a valid taxi and not somebody that's going to drive you off out into the country and liberate you from your wallet. There's 24 states in the United States where hair braiders have to be licensed. They're defined as cosmetologists. You cannot be a hair braider unless you've passed all your cosmetologist exams. And that's getting into territory where it looks much more like rent seeking. It restricts competition. It makes things much better, much cozier, much easier for the people who are already there. Yeah, in the 1970s, 10% of the workforce here in the US were licensed. It went up, it's gone up to about 30%. It's a rather worrying trend, and if a hair braider can be licensed, if a regulator or politician sees that as justified, why wouldn't they see the same as applying to a software tester? But the reason I brought in regulatory capture is that I was at a presentation that was given by Stuart Reid, the chair of the ISO working group that's defined ISO 29119, and he presented his vision of testing, the standards-driven vision of testing. And it was really rather scary. Imagine an industry where qualifications are based on standards. Required services are specified in contracts. And these standards are based on best practices on a great body of knowledge. This could be the testing industry of the future. That implies certification for everyone. There's that implied threat of licensing, and I find that really rather scary. Imagine, yeah. Actually, it comes up with a kerching sound. That was a feature of PowerPoint I quite liked. It's a pity it's not coming over. But yeah, I find that makes me want to scream. That's really quite terrifying for me. So how are they going to be able to do that and get away with it? Well, have you ever felt totally insignificant in the universe, that you don't count, you don't matter, you're not relevant? Well, if you're in the context-driven school, that in effect is how you're defined by the standards lobby. You're defined as being a craftsman, which I think is a really loaded phrase in corporate speak. It implies that you're old-fashioned, irrelevant, small-scale, not serious or relevant. And the reason, I'm quoting here Stuart Reid, this is a slide that he used in Madrid and he's used elsewhere. The people opposed to standardization are craftsmen. And there's a lot of interesting stuff on this slide that, we could take a long time to go through it. What is most likely to stop ISO 29119? It's perceived as competition. Well, yes. There's a lack of compulsion to use it. There's no evidence that it actually does any good. There's the cost of use, it's a complexity, lack of responsiveness, lack of inclusiveness. And this is coming from the standards lobby. So that's why they haven't got the arguments, I believe, to back up, to justify defining ISO 29119 as a testing standard. So they need to define potential opponents as being irrelevant, like craftsmen, not serious corporate people, not the sort of bland corporate tester that I have worked with, that maybe I once was. The reality of testing standards is that the focus will be on the documentation rather than the actual testing. That you'll end up doing drudgery, complying with the documentation, producing the documentation, and yes, the focus will be all on the documentation. And I've had to look at the way that ISO 29119 in effect is being sold, how services are being sold that rely on ISO 29119. And it's been really interesting in the fallout from the healthcare.gov and website problems, how some companies are trying to benefit from that. Here's one, and saying that the lesson to be learned is that there's greater formality and maturity required. And there's that really interesting revealing phrase, peace at heart. They're not selling testing, they're selling peace at heart. And here's another one. What do you think this is here? Do you think that's a sales blurb or a submission to a federal body on how testing should be performed? What do you think? Which does it look like? Well, actually, it's a false binary choice. It's both. In October 2013, that was pushed out by a consultancy firm. And hey, 2 months later, the Water Environment Federation copied and pasted that in a submission to the US federal government. the governments will start to listen to these things. They'll think, well, this is the serious professional testers. Maybe we should be paying attention to what they're saying. There's more examples. Infinite healthcare. The lesson to be learned is set and adhere to standards. See that? See what I did there? Endless opportunities. ISO 29119, well, there's endless opportunism. But infused consulting, see I put in this so in brackets there, that was to actually make make it legible, sorry, coherent, because the thing they'd put in their website was just total, it was gibberish. I had to put in that so to make it make sense. It was a classic example of confused language exposing confused thinking. But hey, 29119, that's going to solve your problems. And this is, I mean, you could have a full-day workshop deconstructing this slide from Infused Consulting. I mean, look at the stuff that we've got in here. Best of breed process, proven methodology, certified, ISO standards, efficient, effective, and this is where it gets better. Guaranteed outcomes, not leaving anything to chance, guaranteed outcomes. And now look at this, eh? £352 per test case. Now, I had to take a screen grab of this. I just couldn't. My integrity wouldn't allow me to type those words, £352 per test case. And also I'd have felt, well, I had to have a screen grab of it because people won't believe it. But £352 per test case, and you think, great, just shove everything into the one test case. But no, you got to buy 2,000 of the suckers in order to get it down to £352 a test case. I mean, Fiona, you've got a word, I think, that an alternative to bullshit for this. Bollocks, yeah. It's bollocks. A good old Anglo-Saxon variant on bullshit. And here's a German one. You probably can't see the detail of this, but the title is The Treasure of the Standards, the certain way to software testing. And I could take you all the way through it, but basically it's follow this route through all these things like the valley of defects, the swamp of inconsistent terminology, passing the chapel of ISTQB certification. I'm not making this up, I'm translating it. It says, with the right treasure map in your pocket, it's easy to find your way. That also goes for testing. The first 3 parts of the new standard ISO 29119 are coming in late summer 2013. We haven't got anyone here who's German, have we? Marcus Gertner's not around, is he? Well, the Germans have a phrase for this too. Völliger Bockmist, utter bollocks. So you've learned 3 different ways to say bullshit. 2 new ways to say bullshit, Anglo-Saxon and German. So how are the standards lobby able to do this? Well, they're selling bogus certainty, and they're also making an appeal to fear. You know, imagine something goes wrong. How are you going to explain that? Now, you could have another half day just deconstructing this statement from Stuart, analysing it. But at root, it's just an appeal to fear. Don't worry, keep calm, use ISO 29119. That bit on the left, that's not ISO 29119 marketing, although it could be eventually. I mocked that up, but it's actually less stupid than some of the real stuff that's out there. In economics, there's an idea called the market of the lemons. A lemon being, a bad, poor quality used car, and what makes it interesting for economists is you can't tell when you're buying a used car if it's a lemon or a really good car, and there's that asymmetry of knowledge. The seller knows, the buyer doesn't, so that forces down the price of the good cars, and it allows the sellers of the poor cars a higher price. So it's really important to overcome that problem by providing knowledge to the people that need it. And the standards lobby have spun things around because they're selling, I think that they're selling the lemon, but they've defined a standard so that they've redefined the lemon as being the high quality item. And they're exploiting the fact that, as Stuart said, the people that buy testing services don't know what they're buying. So they're easy victims. But they, of course, are not the only victims. The wider victims will be testers that have to follow poor, demeaning, soul-destroying practices. But I mean, one of the reasons, perhaps the main reason I get worked up about this is because of my auditing background. When there's this appeal to fear, there's always this implied threat. That was certainly the case some places I've worked, where you had to worry about the auditors. The worst thing that could happen to your career would be a bad audit finding, even worse than making a loss. So I always think that it's really important, and I stress it, what the auditors think, what they believe. Don't try and second guess them. And on the subject of standards, it's really interesting to look at what the auditors say. I'm a member of ISACA, the Information Systems and Audit and Control Association. I've kept up my membership because it gives me access to a lot of stuff that I find interesting. But they've got a governance framework for IT. There's no insistence in there on best practice. They don't expect detailed scripts or test cases. There are endless references to ISO standards for all sorts of good things, but there's no mention of testing standards at all in their governance model, and it is a big thing. There's a lot of detail in there. It took me a long time to check that. I wasn't prepared to rely simply on a text search. And there's another interesting theory, the snowflake theory of IT audit. It's quite a romantic-sounding thing for something as dull, well, not dull, but matter-of-fact and pragmatic as IT audit. Every IT environment is unique and different. It's a bit hippyish, you know, we're all different, we're all special. That came from the Institute of Internal Auditors. It was their Global Technology Audit Guide. It was the first edition. Unfortunately, the second edition cut the length in half, so they removed all the poetic stuff, which is a shame. But basically, the message is still the same. You know, ISO standards are not mentioned in there, except as they're mentioned in the appendix, just for consideration. And these guides are strongly recommended guidance. When an auditor says that, when the auditing profession says to its members that something is strongly recommended guidance, then that is something that they take very, very seriously. It's not just an idle comment, a suggestion. It is strongly recommended guidance. It is something that you should do or be able to justify not doing. And again, from the Institute of Internal Auditors, their guide in auditing IT projects, it says auditors shouldn't expect anything to be implemented en masse. Process guides should be tailored to fit the installation. Now, the standards lobby would say, yeah, well, standards can be tailored, but the way that they sell them, the way that they promote them, it gives people like that appeal to fear. How will you be able to justify not following the standard? When people pick up on that, they think, well, we need to do the whole thing if we are going to protect ourselves. They see standards as protecting their ass. And they're not going to have the courage to deviate from the full standard. They're being encouraged to follow the full thing. That's what the contract lawyers will insist on. That's what senior management will insist on once you buy into the standards mindset. But it's not what auditors would expect. So, wrapping up, I believe that we do, in the testing profession, have to speak out. It's really important that we don't allow the debate to be framed as a false choice between all these magical corporate buzzwords: efficient, guaranteed, effective, best practice, fixed prices per test case, versus some old guy who's irrelevant and out of touch with the modern corporate world. That is nonsense. And remember, buyers are unclear on what is good practice. It's important that we spread the word and communicate and tell them about our view of what testing should be. And I mentioned earlier briefly standards collusion. There was a very interesting case in the USA. The American Society of Mechanical Engineers were sued by the Hydro Level Corporation because two members of ASME, they issued a letter that was highly critical of a competitor's product. It was a valve to make boilers safe, to stop them exploding. It wasn't compliant with the standard, with the ASME standard, and they said it was non-compliant, therefore it was unsafe. The reason it was non-compliant was that it was more advanced. It was equally safe, but it was more efficient, and it was commercially much better. But because ASME had issued this letter saying it wasn't compliant and therefore it was unsafe, it really hit Hydro level. So they came after ASME under the Sherman Antitrust Act, and they won their case, and they won huge damages because it was found that there had been collusion between particular suppliers and the standards body to give the particular companies a commercial advantage. And that had a big impact on ISO and other standards bodies. And the response was that they realized they needed to have consensus regarding standards and the way they were interpreted. And the definition of consensus is a general agreement characterized by the absence of sustained opposition by any important part of the concerned interest. And I think that it's really important that AST should speak out on the subject of testing standards, because so long as there's a debate, it's clear that there's not general agreement that standards are right. There is sustained opposition, and AST are an important part of the debate. Boycotting testing standards is fine in the sense of not actually working with them, but we shouldn't detach ourselves from the debate. It's really important that we do speak out and let the standards bodies, big companies, regulators, politicians, lawyers know that this is controversial, that there is a debate, and that there is not consensus, and the lack of consensus undermines ISO 29119. So, wrapping up, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, trying to understand what's going on, it's always helpful to follow the money, but don't get hooked on it. Thank you. That's it.
No mic. Try again. Open season. Okay, green cards, please. 150, I see. 238 again. 238 again. 258. Karen is 258. So, 026. 0, yeah. Any more? 039. So what I have on the list is 241, 238, 150 to start. So to start, 241, please.
Fiona Charles. The question I have, James, is what is the ISO standard for programming?
Can you stand up? When you speak, please stand.
Yeah, what's the ISO standard for programming? I mean, that's a good point. I guess that if these big, somebody eventually might try and see a way of making money from a programming standard, it wouldn't have any more credibility, I think, than a testing standard, but somebody might try it on. The fact that I don't think that there's a serious intellectual case or practical case for testing standards hasn't stopped it being implemented, and ISO have bought into the idea that a testing standard is valid.
You can't talk without a microphone.
Or without standing up.
Yes, very good.
It just seems to me that you can't have one without the other, and that this is very much a sort of tail wagging the dog kind of situation. Mm-hmm. that should be part of our argument.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good. Yes, I agree.
Next thread, 238, please.
Yeah, and I'm sitting down because I'm going to try and read something. I wanted to add one more example of standards being used to create economic benefit for someone, and that is ISTQB. I'm looking at something that's on their website, was there for many years. It's no longer there, but it was stated for many years. One of the aims of ISTQB ISTQB was economic benefits for testing-related suppliers, such as training providers, consultants, etc. So they explicitly stated, we are doing this to create economic opportunity for people selling training and services related to the certification.
And there could be a justification for that, leaving aside the particular merits of the ISTQB qualification. There could be an argument for that if it was increasing wealth, if they were creating new opportunities, but they are proposing to do that at the expense of people that will not accept, that do not accept that that is a valid way to test or to learn about testing.
Yes, and I found...
So that's why I think it is economic rent.
Yes, and in applying this knowledge in the debate, I found it's helpful to recognize that when you challenge the standard that someone makes a living from, you are challenging their putting food on the table for their family. So we will get emotional reactions. We will get people who shut down because we are threatening their livelihood when we challenge a standard that they've made the sole source of their income.
But we should speak out. We should say that the same applies to the context-driven school. I mean, I would not, if I ever take a job that involves following ISO 29119, you'll know that somebody's got my family at gunpoint. Or they've offered me unimaginably vast sums of money to buy out my integrity, which is always possible. I mean, but yeah, in effect, my refusal to do that sort of work means that work opportunities are more limited. I'm prepared to live with that, but I don't think it's right.
Very good. New thread. We're going to do 39. 150s next, then 238, 26, 258.
Eric Pregler. I was especially interested in how you tied certification back to regulation.
Yes.
And to some extent, I'm surprised that we have not seen somebody somewhere trying to make political hay by talking about how he's going to clean up this software world and put some onerous regulations in how we test, and that's clearly the first place they're going to look.
Yeah. And I think it's important that bodies like AST should be proactive on that point.
I think it's inevitable. I think that the world is already pretty much running on software, and once people figure that out, that this is something we're going to have to face. And if we don't meet the challenge in debating these certifications and these standards, then we're going to really be in bad shape once it becomes law. And then it won't be a straw man anymore about how we're going to get sued and go to jail. It will be reality.
Cool.
Yep.
150?
Thanks, James, for scaring the living crap out of me. I hope you're going to...
You did the same to me a couple of years ago with your blog. Check out Ian's blog on factory testing. Yeah.
I do hope you're going to publish a list of some of your sources, but there's a war coming, frankly, and we've got to start mobilizing now. I'm interested in your thoughts as to what we can do.
Well, as individuals, we keep speaking to people, everyone that will listen. I love writing, so I like writing about this subject. I like writing about anything, actually. But I don't know, maybe the Association for Software Testers should approach ISO and argue that, I mean, as Anna was saying earlier, we're mainstream. Therefore, if a mainstream professional body disagrees with a standard, then that proves that there's not consensus, and ISO should take that seriously and respond. And at the very least, they should. They're not going to withdraw it. I can't see that. It'd be good if they did, but they should clamp down on any marketing that implies that complying with the standard is enough to differentiate you, to prove that you're a better tester than those who do not follow the standard, who do not agree with it. I don't know. I don't have answers. I just want to raise concerns and get a debate started. I think that too many people who are opposed to standards have just said, or in effect decided, we don't want anything to do with them, and they've let the standards lobby persuade ISO that they are the testing profession.
There's a red card in the back. Karen? Please stand.
He's making sure I do.
Can you speak into the mic?
Okay. I have a proposition that here at this conference, we are gathered together and we have an opportunity we could actually do something. So I'm going to make a guess. It's a big assumption, but I think I'm okay. That just about everybody in this room, an expression I heard before, violently agrees with you. I think we're all there with you. And somebody here said, well, what can we do? I don't want to talk about this anymore. I think we should do something. So if there's one thing this conference could do, and it's early in the game so we have time, we could start a petition. We could probably get about 250 people to sign it, and we could be something more than just some freaky, flaky craftsman in a corner, just to kind of use your expression here.
Not my expression. I used that because that is what the standards lobby
I was
uses.
actually shocked
Yes.
when you said that, because I always thought craftsmen was people who are so deeply dedicated to what they do. That's
Yes,
a
but
compliment.
That's how I would have seen it too. But thinking back to my IBM days, I know that craftsmen would not be seen that way by the target
I
market
get
for
it.
standards.
I get it. I'm there with you.
Yeah.
So here's the proposition. You know, I get how time goes. It's really tight. It's always a problem. There's never enough of it. This group of people, not you, I'm not putting this on you, because that would be a heck of a lot to put on any one person, right? We, as a group, could start something, okay? And we, as we're here this week at CAS, could sign it and actually have at least 250 people in our beat, and I bet there's a bunch of people online, who would sign it. Because we need that. We need that. We need to come together on this. We have to stop being super individuals who violently agree but then don't do anything. Because I don't really want to meet another European tester who tells me, well, you know, I'm certified because I have to get a job, but I think it's a bunch of crock. Because I think you had a slide with prisoner's dilemma up there. So I think that's kind of how I read that. So
Sorry,
people, the
what slide?
prisoner's dilemma. So people
Yes,
feel stuck.
yes,
They go,
yes.
they get it, because they have to, like Ben said, they have to put food on the table. So that's my proposition to you, and I don't mean it argumentatively, and I'm not trying to put you in the hot seat. I just think that we as a collective group at this conference could actually do something, and it's early enough in the conference. And I thank you for your presentation and for including facts about why you think the standards is, you know, they're looping out. So thank you. And
Thanks.
I don't know, Griffin, Mr.
Thank you very much for
Facilitator,
that,
perhaps
Karen.
you'd be willing to take a vote to see if there's enough people in this room willing to do that.
I think that would be a good thing to do in a breakout session, or perhaps have a table conversation at lunch. I know that I have energy on that. I note that we have 3 minutes left. There was a comment that I'm willing to have one comment by Keith on this topic, because we only have 2 minutes left. Go ahead.
I'll be real quick because I'm going to follow on from what Karen said. Having personal experience with trying to start a petition and an online petition to get ISTQB and ASTQB to be more transparent about how they actually judge the psychomatic complexity of their tests and whether the validity of their showing that you've gained the skills from taking that certification. What you'll find is you'll be completely ignored and then violently opposed. So I think a petition's a great thing, but what we need to form in terms of your action is a little working group on how to actually get injected into this debate. Because I think a petition, they don't care about at all. But we need to figure out actual actions off the back of that. So I would suggest doing something beyond a petition and have a working group on this. Well, let's talk about it.
There seems to be energy on it. I think this conversation will continue. So we have 1 more minute left. I want to respect the green card, so go ahead.
Hi, Thomas Vaniotis. So it seems like these standards processes are going to lead to a classic two sets of books situation, where you have one that satisfies the standard and produces no economic value whatsoever, and then companies will continue, because they're not stupid, to do actual testing that happens off the book. So I think we can agree that that's a suboptimal, creates a lot of deadweight loss, right? But I guess what I'm curious about is, so what does that do, that second set of books? Does it get a name? I mean, if this happens, if this becomes the standard way of doing things, people will still be testing. So what do you think that does to the craft in the future?
I mean, well, good testing will persist. In fact, you could argue that document-driven testing isn't really testing; it's filling out documents. But I think it won't be rewarded properly. It won't be respected. I've seen testing projects where the emphasis has been all on the documentation. It was the documentation that triggered the staged payments, and it was irrelevant to the real testing work. And there was some great work being done by people under the surface, and it was pretty much ignored by management. They appreciated the results, but they assumed that it was coming from the official document-driven process. And it all just sucked, because the people that were doing the really useful stuff weren't rewarded. It was the people that were managing the process, that were churning out the documents, that were getting the money and the kudos and the promotions. It's not a future I want to be part of. And I want to be. I'm old enough to know I can get out if things turn sour.